California. This is Revolution. And that is me trying to impersonate Slayer playing country music. So, David Griscom, if you're listening, tell me how I did. I've been watching this series that is on Cinemax. I found it on YouTube. There's little like 1 and 2 minute clips on YouTube, and it's a Mike Judge series called like Tales from the Tour Bus, and he does various genres of music in a season. He did funk music and country music, or outlaw country music. I would say country music in general, I guess he covered. And I'm watching the outlaw country segments of it. And, I mean, I don't know if this sounds countryish to you guys. This is about as countryish as I can get. But I do, from time to time, listen to stuff like Waylon Jennings and Hank Williams Sr. and definitely listen to way too much Patsy Cline. But it's a great little series. It's hilarious. Definitely reminds me of stories that I hear or have heard at the studio. I call them like the behind the velvet rope stories. There's stories that you hear on like the behind the music, and then there's like these other stories that, you know, people are usually too embarrassed to tell, or you only hear after the people pass. And that's definitely that series. I'm a bit of a fan. The funk one is just genius, which has also been a bit of an inspiration to music that I make for the clips. Trying to, you know, it's all about the one, as Bootsy Collins said, was told to him by James Brown. But anyway, this episode here is with a woman that I met some time ago before the pandemic. She was sent to recruit me to DSA when I had like signed up to DSA, and she's no longer with them either. Esperanza Fonseca, you may know her from numerous appearances on like Nomiki Khan's show, and various other podcasts. She has a controversial stand on prostitution. I say controversial because she definitely calls out the class aspects that don't really get talked too much when we talk about prostitution. And I'm not really saying sex work in this, because she definitely has her own definition of what she looks at as sex work, and the differences in different jobs, from, you know, people that work in pornography to dancers to people that do cam stuff, i.e. OnlyFans. There's definitely a lot of differences and distinctions. We got into that. Pascal was not on this episode. He was not trying to avoid it. He literally had done like 5 shows in 2 days. It doesn't seem like much, but it does take a lot out of you. And so even when he started booking up all these other gigs, I told him, like, don't worry about it. We can handle this show. So it was myself, Jean Bajlan, and Kuba Rizniski. I'm saying it wrong. Deep State Cuba. And initially, you know, we didn't think about the optics of what it looks like when 3 cis men are questioning a trans woman. How bad that looked. But Esperanza is actually the homie, and it ended up working out real well. The show was great. I actually really enjoyed the conversation. There's definitely some things that I push back on a little bit, and you can hear it in the episode. We definitely took some deeper dives into to more in the bonus patron half. So if you are a patron, you can find that episode there. If you're not a patron, there are links in the description wherever you're listening to this. It is patreon.com/Bitterlake Presents. Also, if you want to be part of these shows, Monday and Tuesday, every Monday and Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time, and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, youtube.com/This is Revolution Podcast. And Esperanza agreed to come back, and we're probably going to have her back with Pascal. He'll be arrested. We won't be doing so many shows at once because there's definitely questions that he would have had, that he did have, that he wanted to, in his words, interrogate. So we did our best to interrogate. So here is the show, featuring Esperanza Fonseca, where we look at how leftists should look at prostitution and sex work. Thank you for listening. Definitely leave your comments. This is one where people are very opinionated. I understand. And I wouldn't say we agreed 100% with everything that was said. Thank you guys for listening. Please subscribe and share, and I am out. Good evening and happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to another edition of This Revolution Podcast. There's going to be a little bit of a different host lineup today. My number one homie dog co-host, my favorite Haitian in all of Miami, Florida, has been on a bit of a podcast tirade of late, and he was on Brianna Joy Gray's show early today, and I think he did another show after that, and he's got something to do early in the morning, so he has the night off. That's okay, because we have, coming all the way live from Springfield, Missouri, he is your favorite professor, Mean Gene Bajlan.
Good evening, Les Miles. It's a pleasure to be here. I can never take the place of Pascal. I don't even have half the Pascal energy. But I will do my best to fill the breach. And I'm very glad that, along with me, there's some other assistance as well, because, Pascal is not a one person.
I was mildly looking forward to doing the show alone, and then I threw it out to my homies to see if they wanted to come in with me, and they did. So also coming from the Great White North, he's hidden in a bunker somewhere. He is Deep State Cuba.
Yeah. So the Sultan finally made you a pasha. Yeah. You've earned it. Congratulations.
I've always been a pasha.
Yeah, not until those tenure papers are signed.
That's true. Not until the tenure papers have been signed, and I'm free to do whatever tenured professors do, which is apparently not that much.
That's the whole point.
That's the whole point, isn't it?
The life. Well, today on the show, our foreign policy correspondents are going to be talking about something a little different today, but I think still we can delve into. Is that Zal I just heard?
Yeah, he gets very excited when he sees you guys on the TV because he thinks he can talk to you.
Gotcha. We are going to be talking about the sex industry with feminist activist Esperanza Fonseca. Before we bring her in, let's play the latest intro clip to get us ready for today.
The meat market is filled with transvestite hookers by night. I don't know, because I live right around the block. I asked some of the boys, girls, whatever, if I could, take a look inside of their world. And they said, sure, Rue, come on. Just so long as you dress up like one of us. Of course, that's what I've done. You like? Let's go see what's going on. Maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe I'll make my rent money.
Well, somebody drove up. They gave me 520s, and it only took a half hour. That's about the best you can expect around here. I'm trying to graduate to a better situation.
Well, about a night you can bring home like 200. And the customers are pretty well, mostly from Jersey, white clientele, and most of my oral sex and some hotel dates.
Are you ever frightened down here?
No, I've been working out here about 2 years, so there's no need to be frightened. I never had a problem. Everybody knows that we're transvestites, and they come out here and they want what they want, and that's about it.
What's the freakiest date you've ever had?
Well, I've done it all. Husband and wife, golden showers, tie 'em up, bondage, you name it, I've done it. Everything.
I got a 12-inch piece of meat.
When you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A nurse. And now I'm a hooker.
Sex work remains a controversial topic both on the left and in broader mainstream circles. In recent years, many on the left, particularly in feminist circles, have organized and campaigned for the legalization of sex work under the slogan, "Sex work is work." While not suggesting that such work is empowering or positive, the movement has worked to decriminalize and destigmatize it. However, others have criticized this approach, arguing that sex work is uniquely exploitive and inherently violent. What defines sex work? Is it inherently exploitive? And if so, what is the political posture the left should take towards those engaged in this form of labor? We ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
It's funny, talking to the girls, I see myself in each one of them. They all want to make a living. They all have the American dream. And what's wrong with that, A lot of people put them down for trying to make a living, trying to make something out of themselves. On television, they sell us the idea that everybody can be a star, and everybody is a star. I've had to talk to people or be with people who who I didn't necessarily know, and I had to be friendly with them, you know, and that's the hooking sense. So what's the difference? I guess the difference is I didn't have to go down on those people, but if you ask me, it's almost the exact same. I love it. I may have to change my vocation.
The situation there is that pimping and brothel keeping and every peripheral activity you can imagine related to the running of the sex trade is decriminalized, which is simply legalization by a different name. Now, what I saw on the streets of New Zealand, I will never forget as long as I live. The first night I went down there, we saw, myself and a colleague of mine, a woman prostituting from the side of the road in her Zimmer frame, right? Now, I never seen that anywhere in the world, and I've been through over 20 countries now researching prostitution.
A Zimmer frame?
A Zimmer, you know those, do they use the same term here?
Like a walker?
Yes, yeah. A woman who could barely stand, she needed the use of a walker to stand up at the side of the road. And in the 5 or 10 minutes after we begun speaking to her, a young woman, many years younger than her, came running up, screaming, crying. She'd just been raped and robbed in a car moments before. The outreach workers who showed us around and spoke to us explained that they have been doing their work now for more than 15 years, so from before decriminalization came in. And what they said to us was that they used to be dealing with in the range of 6 to 8 women out on those streets. Now they're dealing with somewhere in the region of 50 to 60. So that is what's happened in the 12, 13 years since decriminalization came into New Zealand. The trade has expanded enormously, as it always does.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Esperanza Fonseca is a survivor of the commercial sex trade and a member of the anti-imperialist feminist organization Affirm. She is currently based in Oakland, California, and has a 7-year background in organizing workers and tenants for economic justice. She got her start in organizing as a fellow with the Ziegler Young Religious Leaders Organizing Fellowship, where she organized faith leaders to advance economic justice initiatives in the city of Los Angeles, resulting in strong contracts and improved working conditions for food service, hotel, and grocery workers. Fonseca graduated from Whittier College with a degree in the Whittier Scholars Program, Feminist Studies and Liberation Theology. She maintains a blog and writes on ending gendered violence and sexual exploitation. Please welcome Esperanza Fonseca. Hello.
Hey, Jason. What's up, everyone? Excited to talk to you tonight, and a nice intro video. Although I have to say, I hate RuPaul, especially after finding out that he is a fracker.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Look, okay, so part of me doing this footage, I'm not going to lie. I'm a fan of Adam Curtis. I don't like everything he says and does, but I do like his style of filmmaking. And I also... and I'm not saying this because we're a part of Zero Books as well, but I am a fan of some of the stuff that Doug Lane does, which is also a derivative of Curtis. So I do like digging up footage that kind of shocks the shit out of me. And I'm not fucking with you, Esperanza. I didn't Google crazy trans sex work from the early 90s. I'm quite the opposite. And when I found that video, I was like, holy moly, I got to put this in there, because keep in mind, that was done for like a cable access channel in New York where RuPaul was living at the time. And I think he had just got his deal, but I don't think he wasn't RuPaul, right? He wasn't the big blow up guy. He was still RuPaul, the club kid. When the New York club kid, I don't even know if you're old enough to remember New York club kids. And when you think about the fact that that segment was edited and it's still like that offensive, that's what really blew me away about that whole segment. It's like, damn, you could have edited it out. And there's certain things that I even edited out. Like RuPaul was literally asking people, he said, what's the best part of your day and the worst part of your day? I was like, oh man, you sure were cheery. But I also want to say that I actually met Esperanza pre-pandemic, and someone had said, you should have Esperanza on your show. And I was like, who? His name sounds familiar. I was like, it can be the same person I met some time ago in Oakland. And sure enough, I saw you on Nomiki Khan's show. I was like, holy shit, I think I know this person. I reached out and she remembered, and here we are.
It's a small world.
It is. It is. It's a small internet world. Would you want to go first with your question, Kuba? Because you never get to go first.
I feel a little at sea. So
I actually have a question to go first.
Oh, we're going to go Dean first.
Yeah, so, before we begin, we kind of want to talk about sex work and, how the left should approach that. And kind of sort of to set the scene, I'd like for you, if possible, to, define what we mean by sex work precisely. Obviously, we have, people engaging in sexual acts for money, but would you include other kinds of, sex work, including dancing, cam girls, pornography, and these things? What would you call? How would you describe the sex industry? How expansive is it? And do you view all types of sex work as being the same, as being equally exploitative, or is there some forms of sex work would you think are, perhaps not positive, but are like reasonable? So I kind of just want to get a bit of a groundwork question, just to try and, narrow down what we're talking about and the parameters of this conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, of course that's okay. So, most of my work actually focuses on prostitution. I actually do not use the word sex work for multiple reasons. One is because I think that the term sex work was coined to bring people into a political project that ultimately is of benefit only to the imperialists and to the pimps and to the sex buyers. I don't think it is at all a political project beneficial to those of us actually in the sex industry. The second reason is because the term sex work is so confusing because it conflates all of these different things into one. And you see the practical implications of this. For example, when, one time someone was arguing for legalization of prostitution, and they had sent me a link with people whose work was not criminalized, talking about why prostitution should be decriminalized, or rather the act of buying sex, because I think we all agree that, those of us who are in the sex trade, those of us who are prostituted, who have to sell sex to survive, should not be criminalized. And so, the problem with that is you have people who maybe have never been in prostitution in their whole lives, talking as if they are and as if they have a stake in this. When we talk about sex work, we can mean anything from a girl who has a premium Snapchat to someone who, a guy who maybe sells nudes on Grindr, to a prostitute, to a sugar baby, to a porn star. And these are all different things. And if we don't actually analyze them separately, we're not going to really understand what it is we're talking about. So I don't really use the term sex work. Most of my work focuses on prostitution, the global sex trade, sex tourism industry, but I prefer to use the term prostitution or, whatever it is we're talking about.
So that there's you make a great point that the term sex work is very broad and covers a large spectrum of different kinds of sexual commerce. And prostitution, we're talking specifically about sex exchange for money. Within that, within prostitution, there's also a spectrum between women who are trafficked, who often have no immigration status, who are extraordinarily vulnerable, who have been coerced, all the way to high-end escort services. Do you see a class distinction within prostitution?
Absolutely. So, this is another thing that I really attempt to expose in my work, which is that, like everything, capitalism is uneven, it develops unevenly. And so within prostitution, there is also a class character. And that class character, or rather class hierarchy in prostitution, does not change whether it is legal, whether it is decriminalized, or whether it is fully criminalized. Those who sit higher on the class rung tend to have a better experience, although they too face violence. And then the majority of people in prostitution who sit on the, bottom of the class rung in society, the sort of underclass, because let's remember, prostitution is kind of like a floor where women and trans people and gay men sort of fall when we have nothing else. Those of us who sit at the bottom of that class hierarchy are the ones who experience the most violence and the sharpest form of exploitation, regardless of any legal framework that it exists under.
And I wanted to bring this up because when we initially had met, we got into a conversation about sex work in the sex industry and trans women, people in general getting into the industry. And you've written about kind of a glamorization of the industry in your work from a trans perspective. Did you want to kind of elaborate on that real quick? Or?
Yeah. So, as a transsexual woman, I learned very quickly that prostitution is considered almost a rite of passage for us. If you're a rich girl, your parents come from money, you'll probably never have to trap in a hotel room or a motel room in your life. But if you don't come from wealth, there's really maybe two good options for you if you want to transition. One is working a job at Starbucks, because they're pretty much one of, if not the only company that really covers all of your transition-related medical care, such as your, facial surgery, etc. And we know how it is being a waged worker at Starbucks, right? You're going to have to fight to get the full-time hours, to get the minimum weekly hours to even qualify for the insurance. And then you have to stay there long enough, not to mention the jobs are competitive. And then there's the other option, which is prostitution. And not only is it a means to an end of our transition, but it's also, in a way, this means of validating our womanhood and our worth. So, trans women, we sit at this very weird place in society where, on one hand, we are sharply hated. There is a lot of hatred towards trans women by men and women. But then we are also intensely desired and coveted, and men want us. Even if they don't express it publicly, they are very interested in trans women. I'm not saying every man, but there is a very large amount of men that are. And so we are extremely hated, but also extremely desired. And so that produces, or maybe comes from, this sort of fetishized position that we occupy. And because of the hatred and a lot of the, problems we deal with in society, prostitution is a way for us to feel powerful, to feel, worthy, to feel desirable and wanted. Although, of course, it's a double-edged sword, because very quickly you realize that what you thought was giving you validation is actually literally sucking the life out of you.
Oof. Jean, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of talk a little bit more, ask a little bit more about the kind of class divisions that exist within prostitution. You mentioned, obviously, leading on from Kuba's question, that there's this, class division, distinction within the type of prostitution that people engage with. Do you mean that the people who tend to go and, let's say, for want of a better term, the less repulsive wing of the sex of prostitution, they come from the upper class, or is it, is that about the type of people who are buying sex, the social class of people who are buying sex, and how does this fit in with prostitution by cis women, by gay men, and by trans women, and I assume trans men?
Yeah, so I in terms of how we approach a class analysis of prostitution, I think that there's two different ways that I like to approach it. The first is, a sort of general class analysis of what I would call the buyer and the bot, right? So, every prostitute, every interaction in prostitution boils down to an economic relationship between the sex buyer and the person whose sex and sexual and intimate access is being bought from, right? And maybe if you're going to ask me about violence later, I'll sort of save that part of the analysis, because that's what I think the core contradiction of prostitution is, that causes the violence, is that class contradiction between the buyer and the bot. But I think that, let's say we put aside the buyer for a second and we just focus on those of us who are forced to survive in the sex industry. There is class differences among us, like there are among any segment of society. So you have women or, men in the sex trade that are wealthy. Some of them are very vocal on Twitter. But you look them up and, perhaps they married a rich husband and they owned, perhaps a swingers club or a strip club and a porn production company. And you see them presenting themselves as a sex worker. But in reality, they have a pretty high net worth. They own capital. They own a business, right? They own property. And obviously, that is a very different position than the masses of women in the sex trade. We talked about Oakland. Go drive into the gentrified, the gentrified white wealthy area of Oakland, and you're not going to see the white girls walking on the street, what we call the track or the blade, selling themselves. But you go into the working class neighborhood, or the Black and brown neighborhoods, and you're going to see Black and brown girls who don't have money, don't have capital, don't have family money, right? That are out there walking the streets. Some of whom, when you look at them, you even wonder if they're even 18. And so obviously, right, those are differences. And I think it's actually extremely important to talk about that. This guy, I don't know if you could see him in my background. Well, I covered him because my wall's a bit of a mess right now. But, he was an Indian revolutionary. He actually helped launch the People's War in India. And if you read his historic 8 documents, which is where he, like these sort of 8 documents, right, where he sort of outlined a class analysis of Indian society, the need for armed struggle, etc., he talks about the peasants and the need to organize the peasants. But he doesn't just say, organize the peasants, right? No, he says, you isolate the rich peasants, right? You don't want the rich peasants leading the movement. You want to go into the heart of the peasantry and find the poor peasants. And you want to agitate and organize them. And they're going to be the militant leaders of the peasantry. And so in a similar way, when we talk about the sex trade and prostitution, we need to be comfortable with saying we shouldn't be taking leadership on this by the richest people in the sex trade. We need to actually look at what the masses are saying and what problems they're going through.
So it's kind of like there's a kulak class of prostitutes who are acting as trying to present themselves as spokesmen because they have an economic interest in the decriminalization of the sex trade, because they own institutions and sort of the mechanisms through which to make money from prostitution.
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is a group of people in the sex trade that I think are comparable to compradors, right? Who very much are in cahoots with the pimps and the imperialists, right? I mean, for example, you look at this lady, Maxine Dugan, who is the self-appointed leader of this so-called erotic, workers union, right? The so-called Union for Sex Workers. Well, Maxine Dugan, who blocked me after I called her out on this, is a convicted pimp who literally stole around $140, $160 from the girls she was pimping out for doing nothing, right? Well, a pimp does nothing, right? You're not the one in the room. You're not the one risking your life, your boundaries, etc. And yet she's over here presenting at union conferences, pretending to be this sex worker. And people are in cahoots with her, right? And you really have to wonder, how ignorant have we become, or how sort of foggy-eyed have we become, where we see actual business owners, capitalists, pimps leading so-called workers' unions, and we don't think that's a problem?
Well, would you call Carol Lee a pimp? I mean, the woman that coined, or is known to have coined the phrase sex work. I mean, she was a bit of a pimp, or would you say no?
From what I know of her, sorry, my mom is calling me. From what I know of her, no, I don't think that, she's a pimp. I don't know if you have information that I don't, but I do think that she was sort of a voyeur into the sex industry. If you read her article, Inventing Sex Work, which is where she coined the term sex work officially, she talks about how she saw prostitution as exciting, like hitchhiking, and how she fantasized about entering it after college. It's very different than those of us who didn't fantasize about becoming prostitutes, but we found ourselves in a situation where if we didn't do it, we would be homeless or unable to survive.
That's why that clip was showing RuPaul. I mean, there's parts that I definitely edited out. I mean, you see this person kind of gallivanting throughout a track, and some of the people he's talking to, or they're talking to, is actually telling these really horrible stories about how they've had to be out there. They work so many hours a day, and they barely make enough to survive. Yet and still gallivanting through it. Hey, maybe I'll turn a trick or two. Why not? And I don't know if we want to get into the fact that some people do it for certain professional bona fides. I know Kuba looks like he has a question. You want to ask Kuba?
Yeah. So you point out that the majority, the masses in prostitution are, I think I heard a phrase used, trafficked by circumstance, or actually trafficked or otherwise coerced. And so there's this economic pressure, like you said, you might be engaging in prostitution because otherwise the alternative is homelessness, the alternative is penury and economic desperation. So there's that economic pressure, and then there's also the nature of prostitution, where there's risks of violence, there's risk of arrest, there's pressure from law enforcement, immigration, gangs, pimps, trafficking. Do you think that alleviating the economic pressure through UBI or universal coverage of the medical procedures of gender transition, removing as much as possible of that economic pressure, would be sufficient to try to eliminate the really exploitative nature of sex trade or of prostitution? Or is there an essential kind of law enforcement component as well?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of what our program has to be around the sex trade, I think that it needs to be comprehensive, right? Of course, I think that, addressing people's immediate economic needs via reforms such as, perhaps universal healthcare, et cetera, is important. But let's remember that you're not going to be able to lift everyone out of poverty unless you literally overthrow the class that is keeping us in poverty, right? And so that would require actual social revolution. And if we move towards socialism, prostitution would not be a thing. It would cease to exist. We know in...
So I'm thinking of my family. I was born in the People's Republic of Poland, a nominally socialist state, and there was prostitution. And when I think of a country or a society that's closest to actually having a universal level of economic well-being enshrined in their system, I think of Finland, or maybe Iceland, or maybe Norway. Do you think that level is enough, or is it still falling short of where you would be able to see that kind of end of prostitution or end of exploitation that you're talking about?
Yeah, so just to make my point. So I think there's a lot of competing definitions of what nations actually were socialist and which nations weren't. And I'm not necessarily interested in getting into the details on that. I think there are a lot of nations striving towards socialism, but have not actually achieved socialism, which is a transitionary period towards communism, where you cease producing things for their exchange value, and you produce things to meet the needs of people, right, for their use value, which, under central planning, prostitution just wouldn't be a thing. But when I say that, what I mean, for example, is how, for example, in China, which I think was one of the most important revolutions for women before its, capitalist reversal under Deng Xiaoping. But, China, for example, if you look at some academic studies in Shanghai, you find that after the revolution, under Mao's China, prostitution actually began dwindling away in Shanghai, even before the state officially got involved. I could send you that link after. You see, for example, in Cuba, one of the first things they did after taking power was kick out the imperialist sex pests, reclaim Havana, right, and their cities no longer as these giant brothels for imperialist men, right? And so we see that in pretty much every socialist state, when they have taken power, the eradication of prostitution has been one of the things that they have attempted. And when we look at world historic revolutions, like in the USSR or specifically in China, you see that they actually came very close, if not achieved, the realization of that goal.
So I wanted to ask. Oh, sorry, Kuba. Did you have a follow-up?
Well, yeah. You point out that in the U.S. in post-revolutionary conditions, you have countries striving for towards communism through the socialist transitionary phase. That you see a decline in prostitution. You also see a decline in prostitution just from development, like in Finland, South Korea, the Japan after World War II. As the country just gets richer, even under a capitalist system, there's more money to go around, fewer people experiencing that desperation, and prostitution dwindles. So I guess my question is development, at least an enlightened version, like a Scandinavian version, a Taiwanese version, maybe, enough.
And you're talking development of a society, not the model of their sex trade, right?
I'm talking about just economic development.
Yeah. Okay.
And you end up with trafficking into those countries sometimes. Precisely because the development is kind of eliminated the supply of desperate women.
Is this what you mean by when you say, being against prostitution is also anti-imperialist? Because even if you can create good conditions in a country like Finland or Italy, where local women no longer feel, no longer have the economic sort of pressures to engage in prostitution, the continued demand just means that women are shipped in from areas of the global south to kind of meet that demand, which is no longer being dealt with by local supply. Do you see it as a kind of global system and not purely a local system?
Yeah, so under imperialism, the sex trade is no longer a local system. It is a global industry, a global market, and it is also an organized market. In terms of the question around development, I'm not sure necessarily how to answer that because the alleged development programs of the IMF and the World Bank, on top of the militarization projects from the US, are what caused the sex tourism industries in places like Thailand and Southeast Asia. So I don't think development under imperialism is anything other than just the export of, the Washington consensus of neoliberal globalization, economic liberalization, and privatization. So I don't really recognize that concept. I also don't think that I don't think it's possible. I mean, development under imperialism, we literally stop oppressed nations from developing. We literally freeze them in a semi-feudal bureaucrat capitalist state. So I think that, once again, development itself is not really the framework I would use, as much as, fighting against imperialism, which has really caused these crises that have led to the rapid expansion of prostitution and sex tourism in these nations.
Well, let's pivot to the police state when we talk about legalization of prostitution. Your organization, Affirm, has often been accused of, I don't want to say being pro-cop, but almost pro-surveillance because of the anti-prostitution stance. What is your response when people bring that up?
Yeah, so that is an outright smear, a lie. People, sort of create these rumors, for example, trying to say that I work with police or that we work with police or ICE, and it's a complete lie. The idea that we cannot say something is wrong without feeling like police need to fix it is just sort of insidious, right? I mean, it's like the people saying that we are pro-cop because we don't want to expand the rights of pimps and sex buyers are also saying that we should decriminalize domestic violence. I don't really think they are good faith people. I think they're just sort of internet trolls that want to spread lies about a group of women that they are very afraid of.
Well, there's a model in New Zealand that goes a little further than the Nordic model. And I think once you talk about any sort of decriminalization that isn't across the board decriminalization, you get kind of thrown into the Nordic model camp. And I don't even think you're pro the Nordic model, correct?
So my line is the sort of traditional socialist line on the sex trade, which is I believe in decriminalizing prostituted people, those of us who sell sex. But I do not believe in decriminalizing pimps, imperialists, or sex buyers. I think they need to be held accountable. And I don't think we should live in a society where buying women as commodities is acceptable. But I also think that there needs to be an entire program around raising the material conditions for women, for trans people, for all of us at the bottom. And I think that is a sort of very important point.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But I would consider New Zealand to be a massive failure.
Which is total decriminalization across the board.
So would you prefer an approach like somewhere like Sweden where, people who are prostituted decriminalized, but it's a crime to solicit sex? Would that be an approach you think would be better? Or do you think that's merely kind of a Band-Aid on the issue?
Well, I think feminists who think that the Nordic model is an end-all, be-all for the problem of prostitution sort of fall into liberalism because they think that the state is this sort of neutral entity that, we could bend in our favor. I think the capitalist state is an organ of class rule, of class repression, and it will never be bent in our favor unless we literally overthrow the class that rules the state and take that machinery into our own hands. Now, in terms of what policy model I would advocate for, I think that we need to develop a program in our own countries based on our own conditions, based around three main principles. One is decriminalizing the exploited. 2 is holding the exploiters accountable. And 3 is guaranteeing the right to exit and the right to not be prostituted.
So kind of want to, sorry, just have a quick question. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on this though? Why, and this may seem obvious to listeners, but I just want to kind of clarify. Why do you see sex work as a uniquely exploitative form of inverted commas work? You mentioned violence and you said you were going to come back to that. So I was wondering if you could kind of just, why is it different, for sake of argument, why is, being forced to engage with sex work different from people who do other types of physical work that could be dangerous to their health and things like that? What's specific about it? I thought that might help sort of narrow down your, clarify your position a little bit.
Yeah. So firstly, I do not use the term sex work to people like myself who did not have a choice whether or not we wanted to sexually service men. The term sex work is deeply offensive to us. It implies agency, it implies choice, it implies some sort of us freely doing this when we did not. So I do not use that term. But in terms of why I consider it to be uniquely exploitative, we talk about, oftentimes an argument used against me is all work is coercive, right? Nobody really has a choice if they want to work or not. Mm-hmm. So what's the problem with prostitution, right? Well, all work is exploitative, sure. All work is coercive, sure. But when you're coerced into sex, isn't there a word for that? There is, and it's called rape. It's called sexual violence. It's called sexual assault. But yet in our twisted, capitalist, misogynistic, transphobic, racist society, when money enters the equation, it's no longer rape. It's okay to coerce someone into sex as long as money is involved. And that is a problem because the reality is, in what other job are you expected to let men have sex with you to make money? In what other job is it just expected that you're supposed to allow men to enter your body, to do things to you? In any other job, that would be sexual harassment or sexual assault, right? Let's say that you are someone who said, I want to enter the sex trade on my own will, on my own accord, right? It's all great at first. You make money, you feel like you're balling, right? You're like, oh, all this fast money, sure. What happens when you don't want to have sex one day? What happens when maybe you're feeling bad about yourself, or maybe you were raped by a client or by another man, and you have a lot of trauma and you don't want to work? Well, you have bills to pay, you have rent to pay, someone's got to put food on that table. And what happens? You have to do it. You have to have sex. You have to let men touch you. You have to let them enter your holes. That is not choice. That is coercive, and it is traumatizing. And I know because I myself was in that situation. In fact, one time I experienced a very brutal sexual assault, but I was on the verge of homelessness, and my mom was misdiagnosed with a disease and needed Uber rides to get her to her doctor, needed medication, food. I had to keep working in order to help her. Was I really consenting to the things these men did with me? No, I wasn't. I did it because I had to. And why are we covering for a society that forces women, trans people, etc., to have sex against their will? Like, that is sick. Another thing, you mentioned violence. So an encounter in prostitution is between the buyer and the bot, the sex buyer and the prostitute, the client and the escort, right? Myself, having been a prostitute for years, I know we want to do less for more, right? We always want to do less for more. The client, the sex buyer wants you to do more for less, right? So he wants to pay less, but wants you to do more. And that is a struggle. That is a power struggle. Any girl who has been in prostitution, who has been in a hotel room, in a car with a sex buyer, knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? When that struggle plays out over your body and literally inside of your body, some kind of violation of your boundaries is going to happen, because you can haggle over the price of, some commodity that you're buying, right? You can, sort of fight over that, right? But imagine now when someone's inside of you, literally inside of you, and they are haggling with you, trying to negotiate, trying to push your boundaries, push your limits. At some point, you are going to be violated. Not only that, but when we talk about consent, in a capitalist society, when you leave something to the free market, the market forces are going to dictate what you need to do in order to make money more than your individual will. So that's why we see, for example, during COVID, where people are becoming desperate, condom negotiation becomes harder because the market forces have made it easier for clients to demand going in raw. And because women are in more desperate and dire situations, the clients are able to get it. And that's a problem.
Oh, I mean, in the New Zealand model, that was one of the, complaints of a lot of the women, because you've decriminalized everything. You've opened it up to larger pimps that could bring in more women. But the more women you have, you drive the price down. So you have, like you said, a lot of women doing a lot more for a hell of a lot less. Did you want to say something, Gene? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Esperanza, then what do you think the appropriate line should be the political line that, you know, people who regard themselves on the socialist left, what should be their stance towards prostitution? At least what kind of short-term policy should they be pushing, and what should be the posture towards the decriminalization movement, which, you know, it seems that there are a lot of people on the socialist left who kind of orientate towards that kind of politics. So I wanted to kind of get your take on, you know, how do you think this should be operationalized in a concrete political program?
Yeah, so I think like every communist, socialist party, every revolutionary, we need to be sex trade abolitionists, right? When we talk about sexual liberation in the US, we usually talk about liberating our sexualities from control of the state. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget we live in capitalism. So the state isn't the only thing controlling our sexuality. So is the market. So are the capitalists. So are the pimps and the imperialists. So let's liberate our sexualities and our bodies from the state, but also from the market. And until you do that, you're not going to really have sexual emancipation. So in terms of what I think our program should be, one, decriminalizing those of us exploited by the sex trade, right? None of us should be criminalized for doing what we need to do to survive or for being put in this situation. Surviving is never criminal, right? However, the people that benefit and profit from our exploitation should not be decriminalized, okay? I don't think the police are going to stop sexual violence. I don't think the police are going to abolish prostitution. But I do know that what happens to the class of people who coerce women into sex using their money, what happens to the class of people who sell women because they see them as commodities and they just want to profit off of them, I don't care what happens to them. And I do know that in a socialist society, we would have a state that would actually act in our interests and would be able to hold those people accountable. But in the meantime, advocating to expand their rights is not my job. So I do not want to decriminalize the exploiting class in the sex trade, which are the pimps and the sex buyers. And then thirdly, like I said earlier, rights that we need to focus. One is the right to exit, which is the most denied right to women. But especially in the sex trade, most of us cannot exit if we want to. A study of prostitutes in 9 countries by Melissa Farley found that 90% of people in the sex trade said they wanted to exit. That was their number one priority, but they couldn't. We need to fight for the right to exit, real exit programs, housing, money, food, healthcare, therapy, etc. And then number 2 is the right to not be prostituted. Why is it that we don't see someone being forced into prostitution as a violation of their human rights? It absolutely is. And yet the full decriminalization movement pretends like people's rights are only violated after they've been forced into the sex trade. That's not true. Our rights have been violated the moment that we have no other feasible option at survival other than sexually serving men.
What do you say, though, to people? So with the defund movement, and one of those clips that I took was from some time ago, maybe 15, maybe 20 years ago in Detroit. And it was from a local news station out there where, and you can't really tell, but the pimps were circling the girls to kind of corral them. And they would chase them up and down the street to kind of get them in the middle of the street so they could be like, okay, these are our girls, you know, doing whatever they're doing. And the pushback from the police was, well, we just don't have the money in the budget. So as defund the police is the cry, what then do you say when law enforcement agencies say we don't have enough money in our budget to have a vice squad anymore like we had back in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for defund the police. It's not going to happen as long as the capitalist class controls the state. But I do think that we should be putting our efforts to reduce the budgets that go towards police. But that also doesn't mean that I think we should decriminalize heinous crimes, right? I mean, murder should not be decriminalized. Rape should not be decriminalized. Domestic violence should not be decriminalized. And neither should using your money to coerce women who are in bad economic situations into sexually servicing you. That shouldn't be decriminalized either. Now, in terms of what solutions there are in terms of how to address the buyers, well, one, I think that we actually need to start before men even become men. We need to teach boys that women are not commodities. We need to teach boys that that you do not have a right to get your whatever sucked when you want it, how you want it, and that you have a right to say you want it now and get it, right? Most of my clients, sex buyers, they knew that girls were not in there because we wanted to be. In fact, when they would hear me talk, they would tell me I sounded so educated and that, you know, I should be doing something better. They say, oh, you don't have to be here. And when someone says you don't have to be here, what that means is that they know most of the women they're buying have to be there. Therefore, they know that they are preying on their vulnerability in order to coerce sex from them. Because it's literally like someone's like holding money in front of you and you don't have any other way of surviving and they're forcing you to do something to get it. I mean, that's horrible. And I think we need to look at countries that have decriminalized or legalized prostitution, like New Zealand, for example, and see how much of an utter failure it is. I mean, in New Zealand, women still do not have the right to exit, even though pimping and sex buying is decriminalized. So it's an imperialist lie where people think that we decriminalize pimps and sex buyers and somehow life is going to get better for the women that are exploited by the pimps and sex buyers.
Because the exploitation never stops.
Yeah, and so there was actually this one woman in prostitution who was quoted in a media article in New Zealand. And she literally said, not much has changed after decriminalization because he still has the money and therefore he still has the power.
I think that one of the points that you're making is that under market society, it's not just the state that determines how free we are, what we can or can't do, but there's also these market pressures that force people into prostitution, force people to crime, into all kinds of extraordinarily harsh circumstances because their existence is on the line. And that and I think you would say that until there's a revolution, I think you have said that until the class that maintains this market society, that maintains this capitalist structure is overturned, we're not going to get away from that exploitation. Are there steps, and one of the models or one of the comparison cases that one could draw is harm reduction for the drug trade, is where you're not, maybe decriminalization is part of it. You're letting something happen, but you're trying to reduce the negative impact on the people it affects. Is there a harm reduction approach that can be put into place until economic and political conditions allow an end to prostitution through a socialist means?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that I am not an advocate of harm reduction. I am an advocate of harm elimination. I have a few decades on this earth, and I don't want to spend my time on this earth begging for scraps. I want to give it my all and change as much as I can. I also think focusing on harm reduction instead of harm elimination is us buying into the end of history narrative that capitalism has forced on us. I do not believe capitalism is the end of history, and therefore I do not believe that capitalist exploitation or class oppression is also the end of history. I think that we can and hopefully will move beyond that. That being said, I do think that there are reforms which we can and should be fighting for. And as I mentioned, number one is decriminalizing the class exploited by the sex trade, not decriminalizing the class exploiting us in the sex trade. And then 3, fighting for the right to exit and the right to not be prostituted. And I think those 3 things, along with launching a revolutionary movement to demand improvements to the conditions of women and the conditions of workers, I think those 4 points is a program that we can come, unite around.
Fair enough. Her name is Esperanza Fonseca, and thank you for joining us for the hour. We do a patron-only bonus second half. Do you think you can join us for like even 20 minutes, or are you too busy? You can? Word. So I told someone on Twitter I cannot see the chat, so that's why I wasn't very interactive with the chat. I was afraid that if I refreshed the screen that I would lose the whole show. So that being said, we're going to get out of here and head to the patron bonus half. If you are a patron, we'll see you there. If not, patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents is the way to become one. Where is it at? Bam. Thank you very much to my special guest host for dealing with me asking too many questions and having all these issues putting this together at night. Thank you, Jean and Kuba, especially Jean, for helping me with that script for the intro. Once again, thank you, Esperanza. So good to actually see you and interact with you once again. Hopefully one day in real life once again.
Yep. Thank you so much for answering our questions.
And I do want to
really appreciate it.
I do want to say this. I didn't realize this till I looked down on the screen. I was like, damn, we look like assholes because it's like 3 dudes just asking hella questions at one.
I don't mind. I could handle it.
It looked worse than it was. Like, oh shit. So thank you so much. And we are